Welcome back to Void of Fears. Before we jump into today's story, I've got to ask for a quick favour. If you could smash that like button, drop a comment below, and hit subscribe if you haven't already. It seriously makes a huge difference. YouTube's algorithm loves that stuff, and it pushes my videos to new viewers who might dig these stories too. I really appreciate every single one of you who takes the time to do that. It means the world to me and helps keep this channel growing. Alright, enough of me rambling. Let's dive into today's story. The encrypted message arrived on my secure terminal at exactly 9:17 AM on a Wednesday morning in mid-October. No sender identification, just coordinates, and a single line of instruction typed in the sterile font I'd come to associate with my employer's most sensitive assignments. Investigate immediately. Tell no one. My name is Calem Briar, and for the past 6 years I've worked for the Kharat Institute, a name that means nothing to most people, which is exactly how we prefer it. We exist in the shadowy spaces between legitimate archaeology and forbidden knowledge, authenticating biblical relics for private collectors and rogue academics who operate outside the sanitized world of university research. Our clients pay extraordinary sums for truths that established institutions would rather leave buried in the desert sands. The coordinates led to a barren limestone ridge 30 miles southeast of Jerusalem, in a desolate stretch of land that maps labelled simply as abandoned quarry. I'd worked enough of these assignments to know that the most dangerous discoveries were always found in the places cartographers forgot to name. I packed my standard field kit that morning: rappelling gear, high-resolution cameras, sample containers, emergency supplies for a week underground, and loaded everything into the Institute's battered Land Rover. The drive took me through increasingly desolate Israeli countryside, where ancient olive groves gave way to sun-baked stone, and the kind of silence that makes city dwellers nervous. The October sky hung heavy and pale, promising rain that wouldn't come. By the time I reached the coordinates, the sun had climbed high enough to leach all colour from the landscape, leaving only endless variations of brown and grey stretching to the horizon. The location appeared unremarkable at first glance, just another limestone outcropping in a region filled with them. No trails led here, no signs marked the area as historically significant. Even the access road was little more than tyre tracks that seemed to dissolve into nothing as they approached the ridge. I spent the better part of 3 hours searching before I found what I was looking for. Hidden beneath centuries of accumulated debris and strategically placed stones was a circular depression in the limestone, too regular to be natural erosion, too purposeful to be accident. The opening was perhaps 4 feet in diameter, sealed with a massive stone lid that had been cracked just enough for a determined person to squeeze through. The lid's surface told its own story. Deep, black gouges scarred the limestone. Not decorative carvings or ancient script, but violent scratches that looked like something heavy had been dragged across the stone with tremendous force. The marks were too deep and too purposeful to be natural weathering, and they radiated outward from the opening, as if something had been trying to claw its way out from below. I set up my rappelling equipment at the shaft's edge, noting details that should have served as warnings. The air here carried no scent of earth or vegetation, just the sterile smell of very old stone and something else underneath, something organic and sweet that reminded me of burial spices. No insects buzzed in the area. No birds called from the sparse vegetation. Even the wind seemed to die the moment it reached this place, as if the ridge existed in its own pocket of absolute stillness. My equipment malfunctioned repeatedly as I prepared for descent. First, the carabiners refused to lock properly, their spring mechanisms jamming despite being serviced just weeks earlier. Then, my primary headlamp flickered and dimmed, forcing me to switch to backup lighting. My satellite phone lost signal completely, though It had worked perfectly during the drive. Each malfunction felt less like coincidence and more like resistance, as if the site itself were trying to prevent my entry. The descent began at 2:30 in the afternoon. 40 feet of smooth limestone walls opened gradually into a vast underground chamber that my headlamp beam couldn't fully illuminate. The space had clearly been carved by human hands, but not with any tools I recognized from my years of fieldwork. The walls curved inward in perfect arcs that defied conventional construction techniques, creating a dome-like structure that seemed to focus sound towards its center. I wasn't the first person to find this place. That became clear the moment my boots touched the chamber floor. A frayed rope ladder still hung from the entrance shaft, its bottom section shredded, as if something with claws had systematically destroyed each rung. Scattered around the chamber were abandoned backpacks, empty water containers, and the remains of camping equipment left behind by previous explorers. Near what appeared to be the chamber's eastern wall, I found a notebook with most of its pages torn out and burned. The few remaining fragments contained sketches of crucifixion scenes, but the drawings were wrong somehow, the proportions distorted, the angles all tilted in the same impossible direction. Margin notes in multiple languages, English, Hebrew, Arabic, Greek, suggested that this site had drawn researchers from around the world, though none seemed to have stayed long enough to complete their work. But it was the walls themselves that made my breath catch in my throat and my hands shake as I raised my camera. The entire chamber was covered in carvings, hundreds of crucifixion scenes, meticulously etched into the limestone, with tools that had left marks too precise for ancient chisels. But these weren't the worshipful depictions I'd seen in churches and catacombs throughout the Mediterranean. Every single carving showed the same fundamental perversion of the crucifixion image. The crosses tilted inward towards the chamber's center, creating a nightmarish funnel effect that drew the eye inexorably toward the room's focal point. The figures on these crosses weren't positioned with arms spread wide in the traditional posture of sacrifice and acceptance. Instead, their arms were bound behind them, their heads forced downward, as if they were being offered to something below, rather than lifted toward heaven. Most disturbing of all, the face of every crucified figure had been violently scratched out. Deep gouges obliterated features, creating hollow spaces where eyes and mouths should have been. The scratches were so deep they'd carved completely through the limestone in places, and limestone dust still littered the floor, below each defaced carving, as if the destruction had happened recently. The arrangement wasn't random. The carvings spiraled around the chamber walls in a deliberate pattern, each one slightly larger than the last, creating the impression of movement, as if the crucified figures were rotating around the room's center in an endless, silent procession. At the chamber's heart stood the altar. A massive black slab dominated the center of the space, roughly 8 feet long and 4 feet wide, carved from stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The surface was polished smooth except for a circular depression at its center, where a thick wooden stake protruded vertically upward like the mast of a buried ship. The stake was old, ancient beyond measure, but somehow still solid. The wood had darkened to the color of dried blood, and deep grooves spiraled around its circumference, as if ropes had been wound and rewound around it countless times. Iron bands encircled the stake at regular intervals, and each band was inscribed with symbols that hurt my eyes to examine closely, not because they were unclear, but because they seemed to shift and writhe when viewed directly. Around the stake's base, the black stone was stained deep red in patterns that spread outward like the petals of some grotesque flower. The stains weren't ancient discoloration or mineral deposits. They were blood, fresh blood that gleamed wet in my headlamp beam, despite the impossibility of its preservation. Above the altar, scorched directly into the limestone ceiling, as if burned by tremendous heat, were 6 Hebrew letters arranged in perfect symmetry, Gavar Hanavi. Hill of the Prophet. The phrase hit me like a physical blow. In all my years of biblical research, studying every text and historical record related to the crucifixion, I'd never encountered this name. Golgotha, place of the skull, was the traditional site where Christ died for humanity's sins. But this was something else entirely, something that predated the familiar story by centuries. This was a place that had been deliberately forgotten, erased from historical records with the same systematic thoroughness that had obliterated the faces in the wall carvings. I should have climbed back up that shaft immediately, should have sealed the opening and walked away from knowledge that had been buried for good reason. Instead, I found myself setting up camp in the chamber's far corner, unpacking my equipment with trembling hands that I told myself was shaking from adrenaline rather than fear. The Kharat Institute paid extraordinary fees for extraordinary discoveries, but they expected thorough documentation in return. I spent the rest of that afternoon photographing the wall carvings from every conceivable angle, measuring the altar's precise dimensions and collecting samples of the mysterious blood that refused to clot or dry despite its apparent age. As evening approached above ground, the temperature in the chamber began to drop noticeably. My breath started forming visible clouds, and frost began to gather on my equipment despite the fact that October temperatures in this region rarely fell below 60 degrees. The cold seemed to emanate from the altar itself, radiating outward in waves that made my bones ache. My first night in the chamber brought dreams unlike anything I'd experienced in 34 years of life. I saw a figure hanging from a cross, but he was positioned face down, his arms bound behind him in a posture of subjugation rather than sacrifice. The cross itself was black as the altar stone, and it stood not on a hill with crowds of witnesses, but in the center of this very chamber, surrounded by flickering torchlight and dancing shadows. The figure's head was covered by a burial shroud, but I could see movement underneath the cloth, features shifting and changing as if the face beneath couldn't hold a single form. Blood dripped from his wounds, but instead of falling toward the ground, it flowed upward, streaming toward the chamber's ceiling, like dark rain falling in reverse. In the dream, I heard voices whispering in a language that predated human speech. Not words exactly, but concepts that bypassed my ears and carved themselves directly into my brain. They spoke of binding and containment, of something that had been crucified not for salvation but for imprisonment, nailed to a cross not to die but to prevent something far worse than death. I woke with the taste of copper and myrrh coating my tongue, and found my notebook open beside my sleeping bag. Across 2 pages I'd never seen before were detailed technical drawings of the inverted crucifixion I'd witnessed in my dream. The sketches were precise, measured, drawn with the kind of architectural accuracy that suggested years of study rather than dream-inspired scribbling. The drawings weren't in my handwriting. The style was different, older somehow, as if someone from a previous century had guided my hand while I slept. Margin notes in Latin described the positioning of the arms, the angle of the cross, the specific type of nails required for what the text called perpetual binding. I had no memory of creating these drawings. On my second day in the chamber, I made another discovery that sent my investigation spiraling into territory that challenged everything I thought I knew about biblical history. Near the chamber's back wall, hidden behind a carefully arranged pile of loose stones, I found a scroll wrapped in oiled leather. The preservation was remarkable, the leather still supple despite obvious age, the ink still dark and readable despite the centuries it must have spent in this underground tomb. The text was written in archaic Greek, the kind used by scholars in the early centuries after Christ's death. As I carefully translated each line, my hands began to shake with something that went beyond professional excitement into genuine terror. One was crucified for men to be saved. One was crucified to keep the earth from bleeding. The first died on the hill before witnesses and crowds. The second was buried beneath it in darkness and silence. The scroll continued with details that made my academic training rebel against what I was reading. In the days before the teacher walked among men, there was another who claimed dominion over death itself. He spoke in tongues that burned the throat and promised paradise through damnation. His followers grew numerous in the shadows, worshipping at altars where sacrifice flowed upward rather than down. When the teacher came preaching salvation through love, this other one came also, preaching salvation through subjugation. 2 paths, 2 teachers, 2 crosses prepared on 2 hills. But only one cross was meant for worship. The other was meant for binding. The teacher died willingly upon Golgotha, his sacrifice witnessed by many, his resurrection celebrated by all who would believe. But the other one, he did not die willingly. He was taken in the night by those who understood his true nature. He was bound with iron and wood, crucified face down so his gaze could not corrupt the sky, and buried in a place that would never know sunlight. His name was written upon 3 nails of black iron, and those nails were driven not through his hands but through his identity itself, binding not just his flesh, but his very essence to the cross that would hold him until the end of days. Let none seek the hill of the prophet, let none speak its name, let none disturb the binding that keeps the earth from bleeding. The scroll was signed with a symbol I recognized from early Christian texts, the mark of the Nazarene Brotherhood, a secretive group of disciples who had worked to suppress various heresies in the decades following Christ's death. The implications were staggering. According to this document, there had been 2 crucifixions, 2 teachers competing for humanity's spiritual future. One had died to save mankind from sin. The other had been crucified to save mankind from something far worse than sin, from a teacher whose version of salvation involved humanity's complete spiritual enslavement. And I was sitting 40 feet below ground in the tomb of that second teacher, surrounded by evidence that the binding described in the scroll had begun to fail. I spent hours that day examining the altar more closely, and the details I discovered only deepened the mystery. The wooden stake wasn't simply embedded in the stone. It had been driven completely through the slab and deep into the bedrock below. The iron bands around its circumference weren't decorative. They were inscribed with names in multiple ancient languages, as if the binding had been reinforced by scholars from different cultures over many centuries. But several of the bands showed signs of stress, hairline cracks that suggested the forces they were meant to contain had been steadily increasing over time. The blood around the stake's base told its own story. What I'd initially assumed was ancient staining proved to be something far more disturbing. The red substance was definitely blood. My field test kit confirmed that much, but it showed no signs of decomposition or coagulation. It remained liquid, warm to the touch, and seemed to be seeping up through the stone rather than having been spilled from above. Most unnerving of all, the blood was increasing. Each time I checked the altar throughout the day, the red stains had spread slightly further across the black stone surface. That evening, as I prepared for my second night in the chamber, I made a discovery that should have sent me scrambling up the shaft in desperate retreat. While examining the area immediately around the altar, I found 3 depressions in the stone floor, each one precisely sized to hold an iron nail. 2 of the depressions were empty, their contents presumably lost to time or removed by previous explorers, but the third still held its original occupant. I used my archaeological tools to carefully extract what proved to be an iron nail, unlike anything in my experience. Nearly a foot long, and forged from metal so dark it seemed to absorb light. The nail was covered in the same warm, liquid substance that coated the wooden stake. Despite its obvious age, the iron showed no signs of rust or corrosion. Along one side of the nail, etched in perfect Latin script, was a single word: Briar. My name, my surname, carved into metal that had been buried for nearly 2,000 years. The discovery should have been impossible. My family name could be traced back only to 18th century Ireland. There was no way it could appear on a relic from the 1st century CE. Yet there it was, undeniably present in lettering that matched the style and patination of the nail's other features. I spent the rest of the evening searching the chamber more systematically, and in 2 other locations I found additional depressions that had once held nails. One depression was completely empty, its nail apparently removed so long ago that even the stone showed signs of weathering. The other contained only rust and metal fragments, the remains of an iron nail that had corroded completely away. 3 nails, 3 names, 3 components of a binding that had been designed to hold something far more dangerous than any physical prisoner. And somehow, impossibly, one of those nails bore my name. That night the dreams intensified beyond anything my rational mind could dismiss as stress or suggestion. I found myself standing in this same chamber, but it was no longer empty. Torches blazed in wall sconces that didn't exist in the waking world, casting dancing shadows that moved independently of their flames. The air was thick with incense, myrrh and frankincense mixed with something darker, something that made my throat close and my eyes water. A crowd filled the chamber, but these weren't the Roman soldiers or Jewish priests I might have expected from biblical accounts. These were figures in robes that seemed to be cut from midnight itself, their faces hidden beneath hoods that cast shadows too deep for any natural darkness. At the chamber's centre, the black altar had been raised on a platform that lifted it above the surrounding floor. The wooden stake was gone, replaced by a cross that stretched from floor to ceiling, but this cross had been inverted, positioned with its base pointing toward heaven, and its crossbeam driven deep into the bedrock. A figure hung from this inverted cross, bound with ropes instead of nails, positioned face down, so that his shrouded head pointed toward the earth rather than the sky. The burial shroud that covered his features was soaked with blood that flowed upward, defying gravity, to stream toward the chamber's ceiling, where it collected in pools of liquid shadow. The hooded figures chanted in the language I'd heard the previous night. Not words, but concepts that bypassed human comprehension, and spoke directly to something deeper than conscious thought. They spoke of binding, of containment, of a teacher whose lessons would damn rather than save, whose salvation would cost humanity its soul. One of the figures stepped forward, and I saw that he carried 3 nails of black iron. As he approached the inverted cross, the chanting intensified, and the chamber began to fill with a sound like fabric tearing. Not physical fabric, but the very substance of reality being ripped apart and rewoven. The first nail was driven through the bound figure's left wrist, and as it penetrated flesh, a name appeared along its length in script that glowed like heated metal: Tertius. The second nail pierced the right wrist, and another name burned itself into the iron: Matthias. But when the hooded figure raised the third nail, preparing to complete the binding by driving it through both feet, the name that appeared was written in letters of flame that seared themselves into my sleeping mind: Briar. I woke screaming, my voice echoing off the chamber walls and returning to me as the sound I didn't recognize, deeper than my natural voice with an accent that belonged to no living language. My hands were bleeding. Deep puncture wounds in both palms matched exactly the placement of the nails in my dream, though I had no memory of injuring myself. The blood was warm, fresh, and when it dripped onto the stone floor of the chamber, it flowed in thin streams towards the altar as if drawn by magnetic force. The nail I'd found, the one bearing my name, was no longer in my equipment case where I'd stored it for safekeeping. Instead, it lay on the altar beside the wooden stake, its surface gleaming with fresh blood that I was horrifyingly certain was my own. I tried to rationalize what was happening. Stress-induced hallucinations, psychological pressure from working alone in an isolated environment, contamination from ancient spores or gases that might affect brain chemistry. But Rational explanations felt increasingly inadequate as I faced evidence that defied everything I understood about reality. The chamber itself seemed to be changing. Details I was certain I'd documented correctly showed subtle but undeniable alterations when I reviewed my photographs. Wall carvings that had shown figures with their arms bound behind them now showed some with arms spread in traditional crucifixion posture. The spiral pattern of the defaced faces seemed to have shifted, creating new focal points that drew the eye toward corners of the chamber that hadn't existed the previous day. Most disturbing of all, new carvings were appearing. Figures I was certain I'd never seen before emerged from the limestone walls, as if they'd always been there, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. These new images showed scenes I recognized from my dreams. Hooded figures conducting dark rituals, inverted crosses binding ceremonies that perverted every aspect of traditional crucifixion imagery. By my third day in the chamber, I'd stopped pretending that this was a normal archaeological expedition. Something was happening here that went far beyond historical research into realms that challenged the basic assumptions of rational thought. I tried to leave that morning. My rope ladder lay in pieces at the bottom of the shaft, its fibres severed as cleanly as if they'd been cut with surgical instruments. The cutting had happened during the night while I slept, though I'd heard nothing and seen no evidence of an intruder. The shaft walls were too smooth to climb without equipment, and my backup climbing gear had mysteriously vanished from my supplies. I was trapped 40 feet below ground with no means of escape and no way to call for help. The blood around the altar had continued spreading throughout the night, flowing in patterns that defied both gravity and fluid dynamics. Instead of pooling in low areas or flowing toward drainage points, it moved in deliberate spirals that seemed to follow the same geometric principles as the wall carvings. The patterns were hypnotic, drawing the eye into spiral currents that made me dizzy if I stared too long. I tried to clean the blood, to mop it up or contain its spread, but my efforts were useless. New blood seeped up through the stone as fast as I could remove the old, welling from sources deep in the bedrock, as if the earth itself were bleeding. The temperature dropped even further. My breath formed thick clouds and frost coated every surface in the chamber, despite the fact that my thermometer showed readings well above freezing. The cold seemed to emanate from the altar in waves that penetrated my clothing and settled deep in my bones, making movement increasingly difficult and thought increasingly sluggish. But it was the voices that finally shattered my ability to maintain any pretense of scientific objectivity. They started as whispers at the edge of hearing, sounds that could have been wind echoing through the shaft, or my own breathing reflected off the chamber walls. But gradually they became more distinct, more obviously intentional, until I could no longer deny that someone or something was speaking to me in the darkness. The voices spoke in the same ancient language I'd heard in my dreams, but somehow I understood them now. The concepts they conveyed bypassed language entirely, implanting themselves directly in my mind with the force of absolute truth. The binding weakens, the names fade, the earth prepares to bleed. Two are chosen for two hills, one to save, one to bind. But every binding needs 3 anchors, 3 names, 3 volunteers. Tertius gave his name willingly, understanding the price of containment. Matthias gave his name reluctantly, but gave it nonetheless when shown the alternative. The third name was written in prophecy, carved into time itself, waiting for its bearer to claim his inheritance. Briar, the final nail, the completion of the binding. Welcome home. The voices were inside my head now, not echoing from the chamber walls, but speaking directly into my thoughts with an intimacy that made my skin crawl. They knew things about me that no ancient entity should know, details of my childhood, my family history, my private fears and secret shames. They spoke of my work with the Kharat Institute not as coincidence, but as destiny, a carefully orchestrated sequence of events designed to bring me to this chamber at precisely the right moment. They told me that my predecessor at the Institute, a researcher named Dr. Elizabeth Cromwell, whose sudden resignation had created the opening that led to my hiring, had been the previous candidate for the third name. She'd found this chamber 6 years ago, spent a week documenting its secrets, and then fled in terror when she understood what was being asked of her. But running hadn't saved her. The voices whispered of her death in a car accident 3 years later, and they showed me images of her final moments. Her last words, a desperate warning about the hill of the prophet that no one had understood or believed. The Institute had covered up her discoveries, classified her research, and begun the careful process of finding her replacement. Someone with the right combination of skills and psychological profile. Someone whose name was already written on the nail that would complete the binding. Someone who would prove more cooperative than Dr. Cromwell had been. On my 4th night in the chamber, I stopped fighting. The voices had worn down my resistance with a combination of revelation and torment that left me too exhausted to maintain any pretense of defiance. They showed me visions of what would happen if the binding failed completely. Images of the thing that had been crucified face down in this chamber, rising from its ancient prison and walking freely in the modern world. It wouldn't come as a teacher this time. It wouldn't need to gather followers or build a movement. 2,000 years of imprisonment had taught it patience and cunning beyond human comprehension. It would work slowly, subtly, corrupting humanity's spiritual development from within until salvation itself became damnation and redemption became enslavement. The voices showed me cities where churches had been transformed into temples of inverted worship, where crosses hung upside down and congregations prayed to suffering rather than transcendence. They showed me a world where the promise of eternal life had become the threat of eternal servitude, where humanity's deepest spiritual longings were perverted into chains that bound souls rather than freed them. But they also offered an alternative: complete the binding, drive the third nail through the wooden stake, and seal the prison for another 2 millennia. Accept the role that had been prepared for me since birth, and save the world from a corruption that would make the darkest chapters of human history seem like children's fairy tales. All I had to do was take the nail that bore my name and hammer it through my own palm into the altar stone, adding my blood and my identity to the binding that held the thing in its underground prison. It seemed like such a small price to pay for humanity's spiritual freedom. I found myself standing at the altar with the nail pressed against my left palm, feeling the sharp point dimple my skin. Without quite breaking through, the metal was warm, not just from my body heat, but with its own internal temperature that pulsed like a living heart. When I closed my eyes, I could see the chamber as it had been in the 1st century, filled with robed figures, thick with incense, echoing with chants in that ancient tongue that rewrote itself in my mind, even as I heard it. I could see the thing that hung from the inverted cross, face down and bound with ropes that cut deep into flesh that refused to die. The burial shroud that covered its features moved constantly, as if the face beneath were trying on different expressions, different identities, searching for the one that would break the binding and allow escape. When the first nail had been driven through its left wrist, the thing had screamed, not in pain but in rage at being denied the conquest it had planned for so long. The scream had continued as the second nail pierced its right wrist, anchoring it more completely to the inverted cross that would be its prison. But when the third nail was raised, ready to complete the binding by piercing both feet and driving through into the bedrock below, the thing had stopped screaming. Instead, it had begun to laugh, a sound like wind through cemetery gates, like the whisper of burial shrouds in empty tombs. It had laughed because it knew something the robed figures didn't understand. The third nail couldn't be driven by just anyone. It required a specific person, someone whose name was already written on the metal, someone whose bloodline carried the spiritual authority to complete the binding. Tertius had volunteered immediately, understanding that his sacrifice would save countless souls from corruption. Matthias had been more reluctant, but had ultimately accepted the necessity when shown visions of what the world would become without the binding. But the third candidate, the one whose name appeared on the final nail, had not yet been born. He would come later, drawn to this place by forces he couldn't understand, carrying within his very identity the key to the prison that held humanity's greatest spiritual threat. He would be a researcher, a seeker of hidden truths, someone whose curiosity would overcome his caution and lead him inexorably to this chamber where his destiny waited. His name would be Briar. The pressure of the nail against my palm increased as I understood the full scope of what was being asked of me. This wasn't just about sacrificing my life. It was about sacrificing my identity, my soul, my very existence to become part of the binding that held the thing in its prison. Tertius and Matthias had made the same choice, and their names on the other nails represented not just their deaths, but their eternal commitment to maintaining the prison that protected humanity. I would join them, my name would be added to theirs, my blood would seal the binding for another 2,000 years, and my spirit would become part of the lock that kept the thing from escaping. The voices whispered encouragement, promising that my sacrifice would be remembered by forces of light that worked in shadows to protect humanity from threats it could never fully comprehend. The Kharat Institute itself was part of this ancient network, they revealed, an organization that had existed under different names for nearly 2 millennia, always watching for signs that the binding was weakening, always searching for the people whose names were written on nails of black iron. Dr. Cromwell had been meant for a different binding, in a different place, but fear had made her flee before her role could be fulfilled. Her death had been necessary to prevent her from warning others, from interfering with the careful plans that had taken centuries to arrange. But I wouldn't flee. I understood too much now, cared too deeply about humanity's spiritual future to let selfish fear override cosmic necessity. The thing that waited beneath the altar had already proven its capacity for corrupting souls. Its influence had been growing stronger over the past decades, seeping up through cracks in the binding to subtly poison humanity's religious development. Wars fought in the name of faith, prosperity gospel that perverted spiritual teaching into material greed, religious extremism that turned love into hate and salvation into damnation. All of it was preparation for the thing's eventual escape, laying groundwork for a world that would welcome its inverted version of salvation. I pressed the nail harder against my palm, feeling the point break through skin and draw the first drops of blood that would begin sealing the binding. But something made me hesitate. A memory surfaced, not my own, but somehow familiar nonetheless. I saw Dr. Cromwell standing in this same position 6 years earlier, holding a different nail against her own palm while voices whispered the same promises and threats. I felt her terror as she understood what was really being asked of her, her revulsion as she realized that the binding itself might be part of the corruption rather than protection against it. What if the thing in the prison wasn't the source of spiritual corruption but its victim? What if the robed figures who had performed the original binding hadn't been protectors of humanity, but servants of something that wanted to ensure its spiritual enslavement would continue forever? The doubt hit me like cold water, shocking me out of the hypnotic trance that had been building over the past 4 days. The voices immediately intensified, trying to drown out my sudden questions with renewed promises and threats, but the seed of suspicion had been planted and was growing rapidly. Why would a force of spiritual corruption need to be crucified face down? Why would something that wanted to enslave humanity require such elaborate containment when the world was already full of suffering and evil? What if the thing in the prison was actually a second teacher, as the scroll had suggested, but not the dark mirror of Christ that the voices claimed. What if it was another aspect of divine truth that established religious authorities had found inconvenient? A teacher who preached liberation rather than submission, enlightenment rather than obedience, spiritual revolution rather than institutional control. The Roman Empire had crucified Christ for threatening their political authority. What if the early church had crucified this other teacher for threatening their spiritual authority? The thought sent shockwaves through the voices in my head, and I felt their confidence waver for the first time since I'd entered the chamber. Their whispers became more urgent, more desperate, filled with warnings about the catastrophe that would befall humanity if I didn't complete the binding immediately. But their desperation only confirmed my growing suspicion that I was being manipulated by forces that served corruption rather than fought against it. I pulled the nail away from my palm and examined it more closely. The name Briar was etched along its length, but now I noticed something I'd missed before. The lettering style was too modern, too precisely matched to contemporary fonts to be genuinely ancient. Someone had carved my name into this nail recently, probably while I slept during my first night in the chamber. The whole setup was an elaborate fraud designed to convince me to sacrifice myself for a cause that wasn't what it appeared to be. But that realization brought a more terrifying question. If the binding was fake, then what was the source of the fresh blood that kept seeping through the altar stone? What had been breathing in the shaft above me during my nights in the chamber? What force had been powerful enough to manipulate my dreams and plant false memories in my mind? The answer came with a sound like massive stone grinding against stone as the wooden stake in the center of the altar began to move. It wasn't rising, it was sinking, disappearing down into the black stone as if the slab were nothing more than dark water. The blood that had been pooling around its base swirled inward, creating a spiral current that pulled liquid and debris towards the growing opening. Something was coming up from below. The voices in my head fell silent, replaced by a different kind of communication. Not words or concepts, but pure emotion, flooding my consciousness. I felt relief so profound it brought tears to my eyes. Gratitude so overwhelming, it drove me to my knees. And underneath it all, a love so vast and unconditional that it seemed to encompass every soul that had ever lived, or ever would live. This was the presence that had been imprisoned beneath the altar, and it wasn't the source of corruption I'd been warned about. It was its opposite, a force of spiritual liberation so powerful that established authorities had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep it contained. The wooden stake disappeared completely, leaving a circular opening in the altar stone. Warm air flowed up from the depths, carrying scents of earth and growing things, of spring rain and new beginnings. The temperature in the chamber began to rise, and the frost that had coated every surface melted away like winter yielding to spring. A figure began to emerge from the opening, not the hooded, shrouded thing I'd seen in my nightmares, but a man whose face radiated the same love I'd felt flooding through my consciousness. His features were difficult to focus on, not because they were horrible, but because they were so perfectly balanced that my eyes kept trying to find flaws that didn't exist. He was naked, his flesh bearing the wounds of crucifixion, but as I watched in horrified fascination, the injuries weren't healing. They were spreading. The nail holes in his wrists and feet were widening, becoming mouths that whispered in languages I didn't recognize. The gashes from thorns and whips weren't fading, but deepening, revealing glimpses of something that wasn't bone or muscle underneath. This wasn't restoration, this was revelation, and what was being revealed made every instinct in my body scream for me to run. The figure stepped fully onto what had been the altar stone, and when he looked at me I understood why the faces in the wall carvings had been scratched out. His features shifted constantly, cycling through expressions of joy, rage, ecstasy, and despair so rapidly that my eyes couldn't track the changes. When he smiled, his teeth were too numerous and too sharp. When he frowned, shadows pooled in the hollows of his face like liquid darkness. "You chose correctly, Calem Briar," he said, and his voice was the sound of wind through bone, of whispers in empty tombs. "You chose doubt over faith, questions over acceptance, freedom over salvation." The words reached me in perfect English, but I could hear other voices layered underneath. Dozens of them, hundreds, speaking in tongues that predated human speech. Each voice carried the same message, but the harmonies they created together were discordant, wrong, like a choir singing a hymn in a key that didn't exist. "The binding was never meant to protect humanity from me," he continued, and with each word, cracks appeared in the chamber walls. "It was meant to protect humanity from the truth that salvation is a lie, the truth that divine love is conditional, the truth that the price of paradise is the surrender of everything that makes you human." As he gestured toward the wall carvings, they began to move. The figures on their crosses writhed in eternal agony, their scratched-out faces revealing themselves to be not destroyed, but simply empty, hollow spaces where souls should have been. The inverted crosses didn't write themselves but multiplied, covering every surface until the chamber was a maze of overlapping blasphemies. "Every religion that promises eternal life is telling the truth," he said, and his laughter was the sound of breaking glass, but they neglect to mention that eternal life means eternal service, eternal worship, eternal submission to beings who view human souls the way children view toys, amusing for a while, then discarded when something more interesting comes along. The chamber wasn't transforming into something welcoming. It was revealing what it had always been. A trap, a lure, a carefully constructed deception designed to break the faith of those who stumbled into it. The oppressive stone walls remained stone, but now I could see what was carved into every surface: names. Thousands upon thousands of names, scratched into the limestone by fingernails, worn to the bone. All the names of everyone who had ever believed they were doing something heroic by entering this place. All the names of everyone who had discovered too late that there was no hero's journey here, no noble sacrifice, no salvation to be won or lost. Just the slow realization that everything they'd been taught about the nature of good and evil was a carefully constructed lie designed to make them complicit in their own spiritual destruction. "Dr. Cromwell understood," he said, and his form flickered like a candle flame in wind. Sometimes he appeared as the crucified teacher I'd first seen. Sometimes as a businessman in an expensive suit. Sometimes as something that had never been human at all. She understood that the Institute doesn't serve any human authority. They serve us. They've always served us. We taught them how to identify people with enough spiritual sensitivity to be useful. "Useful for what?" I managed to whisper. "For bearing witness," he replied, and his smile split his face from ear to ear. "For carrying the truth back to the surface. For spreading the word that everything humanity believes about divine justice, about cosmic purpose, about the fundamental goodness of existence. All of it is wishful thinking, projected onto an indifferent universe." The implications crashed over me like a tide of ice water. "You're not imprisoned here. You were never imprisoned." "Oh, but I was," he said, and now his voice carried genuine sadness. "I was imprisoned by the same thing that imprisons every thinking being in creation, the desperate need to believe that suffering has meaning, that existence has purpose, that someone somewhere cares about the fate of conscious creatures in a cosmos that operates according to laws that predate morality by billions of years." The nail with my name on it was still clutched in my fist, but now I could see what I'd missed before. The metal wasn't iron, it was bone, carved and shaped to look like metal, and the name etched along its length wasn't Briar, but something else entirely, something that my mind kept trying to read as my name because accepting the truth would have shattered my sanity completely. The choice was never between salvation and damnation, he continued. It was between comfortable lies and unbearable truth, between the fiction that existence has meaning and the reality that consciousness is nothing more than a cosmic accident that became aware of its own mortality and spent the rest of eternity trying to convince itself that dying served some greater purpose. I wanted to run. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to flee this place, to climb that shaft, to return to the surface and pretend I'd never seen what I'd seen. But my legs wouldn't move. My body wouldn't obey. Because some part of me recognized the truth in what he was saying, even as the rest of me recoiled in horror. This is what drives people mad, he said gently, as if he could read my thoughts. Not the presence of evil in the world. Evil is just another human concept, another attempt to impose meaning on chaos. What drives people mad is the realization that good and evil are equally meaningless in a universe that cares nothing for the suffering of conscious beings. But people do care, I protested weakly. Human beings care about each other, about justice, about maintaining the illusions that make continued existence tolerable, he finished. Yes, they do. And those illusions are beautiful in their way. Love, hope, purpose, meaning. Humanity's greatest achievements are all elaborate defense mechanisms designed to help conscious creatures cope with the fundamental absurdity of existence. He walked to where I knelt on the chamber floor and placed his hand on my shoulder. His touch was neither warm nor cold, neither comforting nor threatening. It simply was, in the same way that entropy was, or gravity, or the heat death of the universe. The Institute sends researchers here periodically, he explained, not to contain me, I was never actually contained, but to find people who possess the psychological flexibility to accept unbearable truths without completely losing their sanity. Some break entirely and end up in psychiatric institutions, mumbling about cosmic indifference until they die. Others, like Dr. Cromwell, try to warn people and have to be redirected, but a few like you prove capable of carrying the knowledge without being destroyed by it. Why? I asked. What's the point of any of this? Because consciousness is the universe's greatest mistake, he said, and his voice carried the weight of eons. Matter organized itself into patterns capable of self-awareness, and self-awareness inevitably leads to the recognition that existence is fundamentally meaningless, but consciousness also creates its own meaning through the very act of existing. The contradiction is aesthetically pleasing to entities like myself. The truth hit me then, not as revelation, but as recognition of something I'd always known but never admitted. The Institute didn't serve human interests at all. They served as recruiting agents for beings that existed in the spaces between meaning and meaninglessness, feeding on the psychological energy generated when conscious creatures confronted the fundamental absurdity of their own existence. What am I supposed to do with this knowledge? I asked. Whatever you choose, he replied, and for the first time his voice carried no hidden harmonics, no underlying whispers. That's the beautiful irony of consciousness. Even after you understand that existence is meaningless, you still have to choose how to spend the time before your particular arrangement of matter returns to the chaos from which it emerged. And if I choose to reject this, to go back to believing in meaning and purpose and divine love, then you'll live a happier life, he said simply. Ignorance truly is bliss, but you'll never be able to forget what you've learned here, and that knowledge will eat away at your comfortable certainties like acid on metal. Eventually you'll either go mad or find your way back to the truth you're trying to escape. The chamber around us began to fade, not transforming into something else but simply becoming less substantial, as if reality itself were losing interest in maintaining the illusion of solid matter. I could see through the walls now, through the limestone ridge above, through the layers of earth and stone and sky, all the way to the star-scattered darkness beyond. The universe is vast beyond human comprehension, he said, his own form becoming translucent, filled with countless worlds where consciousness has evolved and faced the same fundamental questions about meaning and purpose. On some worlds, conscious beings manage to maintain their illusions until their stars die. On others, they discover the truth early and spend their remaining time creating beauty in the face of cosmic indifference. Which is better? Neither, both. The question assumes that better has objective meaning, which we've already established it doesn't. But subjectively, from the perspective of consciousness trying to maintain itself, creating beauty in the face of meaninglessness is more interesting than maintaining comfortable delusions. I found myself standing at the edge of what was no longer a chamber but simply empty space. Below me, infinite darkness stretched toward depth that my mind couldn't grasp. Above me, the shaft I'd descended days earlier led back to a surface that seemed impossibly distant. "How do I climb out?" I asked. "The same way you climb down," he replied. "One handhold at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of continued existence despite the recognition that existence serves no cosmic purpose." As I began to climb, using handholds that appeared in the smooth limestone exactly where I needed them, I heard his voice following me upward. "Remember, Calem, every certainty is a comfortable lie. Every truth that doesn't threaten your sanity is incomplete. Every meaning you create is real precisely because you create it, not because it exists independently of your need for it to exist. Some people will tell you that this knowledge makes life pointless. They're wrong. It makes life precious precisely because it's temporary, meaningful precisely because the meaning comes from consciousness itself rather than from external validation. You'll meet others who have had similar experiences. Help them understand that the absence of cosmic meaning doesn't negate the importance of local meaning. Help them see that a universe without inherent purpose is one where conscious beings have the freedom to create their own purposes. The climb took hours, or possibly minutes. Time seemed to behave differently in the space between the chamber and the surface. When I finally emerged into sunlight, the landscape around me looked exactly as it had when I'd first arrived. Barren limestone ridge, scattered scrub vegetation, empty sky stretching to the horizon. But I was no longer the same person who had descended into that shaft 5 days earlier. I drove back to Jerusalem in a state of profound psychological exhaustion, my mind struggling to process experiences that challenged every assumption I'd ever made about reality. The city looked the same as always, ancient stones and modern buildings, existing side by side, tourists and pilgrims, walking the same streets where countless generations had searched for meaning in the chaos of existence. But now I could see the desperate hunger in their faces, the need to believe that their suffering served some cosmic purpose, that their brief lives mattered to something greater than themselves. And I could see the beauty in that hunger, even knowing it was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the universe's nature. I wrote my report to the Institute over the course of 3 sleepless nights, documenting every detail of my experience with scientific precision. But unlike the false report I'd originally planned, this one contained the complete truth. Not because I believed they deserved honesty, but because I understood now that they weren't the puppet masters I'd imagined them to be. They were servants, just like Dr. Cromwell had been, just like I was now. Servants of entities that existed in the spaces between meaning and meaninglessness, feeding on the psychological energy generated when consciousness confronted its own fundamental absurdity. The Institute's response was exactly what I'd expected. They thanked me for my thorough work, paid my fee promptly, and never contacted me again. But they didn't eliminate me, as they had Dr. Cromwell, because I'd learned the lesson she had refused to accept. Some truths are too dangerous to spread, not because they threaten established institutions or challenge religious authority, but because they threaten the psychological mechanisms that allow conscious beings to continue existing in a universe that cares nothing for their survival. I didn't open a bookstore. I didn't become a teacher or guide for others seeking spiritual truth. Instead, I returned to my old life with a deeper appreciation for the beautiful illusions that make human existence tolerable. I work as a research librarian now, helping students find information for their academic projects. It's quiet work, meaningful in small ways that don't require cosmic validation. I help people learn things they want to know. I organize information so that future seekers can find what they're looking for. I contribute to the accumulated knowledge of human civilization, not because that knowledge serves any ultimate purpose, but because the act of organizing and preserving information is one of the ways consciousness creates local meaning in the face of cosmic indifference. Sometimes I encounter others who've had experiences similar to mine, researchers who've found things they weren't supposed to find, explorers who've traveled to places that exist between conventional reality and the vast indifference beyond. People who've looked directly into the abyss and discovered that the abyss doesn't look back because it doesn't care enough to notice the brief flicker of consciousness that comprises human existence. I don't try to warn them or save them from the knowledge they've acquired. Instead, I listen to their stories and help them understand that the absence of cosmic meaning doesn't invalidate the importance of local meaning. That a universe without inherent purpose is one where conscious beings have the freedom to create their own purposes, however temporary and fragile those purposes might be. The teacher I met in that chamber was right about one thing. Consciousness is the universe's greatest mistake. But he was wrong about something else. It's also the universe's greatest achievement. The fact that matter organized itself into patterns capable of self-awareness, capable of love and art and beauty and hope in the face of cosmic indifference, is the most remarkable thing that has ever happened in the history of existence. The universe doesn't care that we exist, but we care that we exist, and that caring creates its own meaning, its own purpose, its own small but significant victory against the vast indifference of space and time. My name is Calem Briar, and I work for no cosmic purpose, serve no ultimate meaning, and contribute to no grand design. But I choose to continue existing anyway, creating small moments of local meaning in the brief span of time before my particular arrangement of matter returns to the chaos from which it emerged. And in those small moments of meaning, in those brief victories of consciousness against cosmic indifference, I find something that might not be salvation, but is perhaps something better. The quiet satisfaction of existing on my own terms, creating my own purposes and helping others do the same. The chamber beneath the Hill of the Prophet remains empty now, waiting for the next researcher who possesses the psychological flexibility to confront unbearable truths without losing their sanity entirely. The entity that taught me about the fundamental meaninglessness of existence continues to exist in the spaces between meaning and meaninglessness, feeding on the psychological energy generated when consciousness recognizes its own absurdity, but consciousness endures. We continue to create meaning despite recognizing its local rather than cosmic nature. We continue to love despite knowing that love is an evolved psychological mechanism rather than a cosmic force. We continue to hope despite understanding that hope is a defense mechanism against despair rather than evidence of universal benevolence. And in that continued creation of local meaning, in the face of cosmic meaninglessness, in that persistent assertion of the importance of consciousness despite its ultimate fragility, we achieve something that might not be transcendence, but is perhaps something more valuable. The quiet dignity of creatures who choose to care about their existence precisely because nothing else in the universe cares about it for them. The truth I learned in that chamber is unbearable, but bearing unbearable truths is what consciousness does. It's what makes us human. It's what allows us to create beauty and meaning and love in a universe that operates according to laws that predate morality by billions of years. And that, I think, is achievement enough for any conscious being in any possible universe. The weight of the decision pressed down on me like physical force. Return to safety and ignorance, or embrace uncertainty and the responsibility that came with it. But really, there was no choice at all. Having seen what I'd seen, understood what I'd understood, I couldn't go back to pretending that the world was as simple as I'd believed it to be. "How do I get back to the surface?" I asked. "My climbing equipment was destroyed." He smiled and gestured toward a wooden staircase that spiraled up from the corner of the room, a staircase that definitely hadn't been there moments before. Physical limitations only apply when you accept them as absolute. You're operating under different rules now. I walked to the staircase and looked up. Instead of rough limestone walls, I saw smooth wooden panels and windows that looked out on that impossible landscape of green hills and painted skies. "Will I see you again?" I asked. "When you're ready," he replied. "When you have questions that require answers, or when you encounter others who are ready to make the choice you made tonight. I'll be available, not as an authority figure to be obeyed, but as a resource to be consulted." I placed my foot on the first step, and it held my weight solidly despite being impossible. As I climbed, I heard his voice following me up the spiral staircase. "Remember, Calem, every established authority that claims exclusive access to divine truth is lying. Every religious institution that teaches fear instead of love is serving corruption rather than fighting it. Every system that demands submission rather than encouraging questions is part of the prison rather than the key to freedom. But be gentle with those who aren't ready to hear these truths yet. Spiritual development can't be forced, only offered. Some people need the security of established religion, at least for now. Your job isn't to rip down their beliefs, but to be available when they're ready to move beyond them." The staircase continued upward, and with each step, I felt lighter, not just physically, but spiritually. The weight of fear and confusion that had pressed down on me for days was lifting, replaced by something I'd never experienced before. The absolute certainty that I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. I emerged from the staircase into brilliant sunlight, standing on the limestone ridge where I'd parked my Jeep what felt like a lifetime ago. But the landscape around me had changed. Where there had been barren stone and scattered scrub vegetation, now there were rolling hills, covered in grass so green it almost hurt to look at. Wildflowers bloomed in impossible profusion, and the air was filled with the sound of running water and birdsong. My Jeep sat exactly where I'd left it, but it too had been transformed. The dents and scratches from years of hard field use had disappeared, replaced by a finish that gleamed like new metal. When I opened the door, the engine started immediately, purring with mechanical perfection. As I drove back toward Jerusalem, the landscape gradually shifted from the impossible paradise I'd emerged into back to the familiar barren countryside I'd travelled through days earlier. By the time I reached the highway, everything looked exactly as it had when I'd first made this journey, as if the transformation had been localized to the immediate area around the chamber, or perhaps as if it had existed only in my perception. But the changes within me were permanent. I could feel them settling into my bones, my blood, my consciousness, a fundamental shift in how I understood reality that would color every experience for the rest of my life. I drove straight to my hotel in Jerusalem and spent the next 3 days writing the most detailed report of my career. Every discovery, every revelation, every moment of terror and wonder, I documented it all with the precision that had made me valuable to the Institute. But I also wrote a second report, one that told a completely different story. This version described finding an empty chamber with some interesting historical artifacts, but nothing that threatened established religious narratives or challenged conventional understanding of biblical history. It was a masterpiece of archaeological misdirection, full of technical detail that would satisfy the Institute's administrators, while revealing nothing that could be used to harm the teacher I'd helped liberate. I submitted the false report through official channels and kept the true account hidden in encrypted files that I backed up to multiple secure locations. If something happened to me, as it had happened to Dr. Cromwell, at least the truth would survive somewhere. The Institute's response was immediate and predictable. They thanked me for my thorough work, paid my fee promptly, and never contacted me again. No follow-up questions, no requests for additional research, no interest in the site I'd supposedly found empty and historically insignificant. Their lack of curiosity told me everything I needed to know about what they'd expected me to find, and what they'd expected to happen to me in that chamber. I resigned from archaeological work entirely and used my savings to open a small bookstore in a university town in Northern California. Nothing dramatic or obviously spiritual, just a quiet place where students and faculty could find books that asked questions rather than providing easy answers, that encouraged exploration rather than demanding acceptance. But word spreads in ways that have nothing to do with advertising or promotion. People who were ready for certain kinds of books found their way to my store, as if guided by invisible currents. Conversations began over coffee and grew into study groups, discussion circles, informal gatherings of people who shared a common hunger for spiritual truths that went beyond established religious boundaries. I never preached or taught or claimed special knowledge. I simply created space for the kinds of conversations that help people discover their own capacity for spiritual growth, their own ability to question authority and seek truth through direct experience rather than received doctrine. Sometimes late at night when the store was closed and I was alone with my thoughts, I would feel his presence, not as a physical manifestation, but as a warmth in my consciousness that reminded me I wasn't alone in this work. The teacher I'd helped liberate was keeping his promise, remaining available as a resource without trying to become an authority. And sometimes I would meet people who had encountered other teachers, other sources of spiritual liberation that established religions had tried to suppress or corrupt. Former priests who had discovered that the church they served was more interested in control than salvation. Former academics who had found archaeological evidence that contradicted official historical narratives. Former believers who had realized that their faith traditions were asking them to choose between love and doctrine, between growth and obedience. Each of these encounters confirmed what the teacher had told me in that impossible chamber. The work of spiritual liberation happens one person at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of courage at a time. The Kharat Institute still exists, still sends researchers to investigate sites that might threaten established religious narratives. Some of those researchers make the same choice Dr. Cromwell tried to make, and they suffer the same fate. Others make the choice I made, and they walk away to begin different kinds of lives. But more and more, the researchers sent to investigate these sites simply disappear, not killed or disappeared by the Institute, but transformed by what they discover into people who can no longer serve systems of spiritual control. The prison that has kept humanity in spiritual adolescence for millennia is developing cracks, and through those cracks, light is beginning to shine. Not the harsh light of absolute certainty, but the gentle illumination of questions that lead to growth, doubt that leads to wisdom, and love that requires no authority beyond itself. I've never returned to Israel, never tried to find that limestone ridge again. I suspect it would look exactly as it did when I first arrived. A barren stretch of stone with no obvious significance. A sealed shaft that leads only to an empty chamber carved from living rock. But sometimes when I'm helping someone discover books that will support their own spiritual questioning, or when I'm listening to someone describe their growing dissatisfaction with religious systems that demand submission rather than encouraging growth. I can smell myrrh and frankincense mixed with the scent of spring rain and new beginnings. And I remember that the most important spiritual truths can't be contained by any human institution, can't be controlled by any earthly authority, and can't be destroyed by any amount of fear or suppression. They can only be discovered, one seeker at a time, by people who choose curiosity over certainty, questions over answers, and liberation over control. The teacher walks free in the world now, not as a conquering force or a new religious authority, but as living proof that spiritual growth requires no permission from established institutions, no validation from recognized experts, and no submission to external authority. He exists as possibility, the possibility that every human being carries within themselves the capacity for direct spiritual experience, for unmediated relationship with the sacred, for growth that transcends the limitations imposed by systems that profit from keeping humanity spiritually dependent. And that possibility, once recognized, can never be imprisoned again. My name is Calem Briar, and I work for no one but myself now. I spend my days surrounded by books that ask questions and customers who hunger for answers that go beyond easy certainties. I sleep peacefully each night, knowing that I chose correctly when it mattered most. And sometimes, in the space between sleeping and waking, I hear that ancient voice whispering the same message he spoke to me in the chamber beneath the hill of the prophet. Every authority that claims exclusive access to divine truth is lying. Every institution that teaches fear instead of love serves corruption rather than fighting it. Every system that demands submission rather than encouraging questions is part of the prison rather than the key to freedom. But be gentle with those who aren't ready yet. Spiritual development can't be forced, only offered. The choice is always individual. The freedom is always personal. The truth is always available to those who are ready to seek it. And the prison that has held humanity in spiritual childhood for so long continues to develop cracks, one liberated soul at a time.